Hi, this is Mrs. Solomon. This is our first screencast. This is our first lesson and overview of the New Testament. And in this lecture, these are the questions that we're going to answer. We're going to ask, what is the New Testament? And who were the New Testament writings written by, and who were they written for? We're going to ask the question and answer, what is the relationship between the New Testament and the Hebrew Scriptures? We're going to find out what is the Septuagint and what is its significance in light of the New Testament. And then we're going to discuss how we should study the New Testament and what is important to consider as we study these writings. But first, let's do a brief review. The word Bible comes from the Greek word ta biblia, which means the books. So we're not talking about one single book. We're talking about a collection of books that were written not by one person, but by a number of different people. And remember that the Christian Bible contains two divisions. The Old Testament, which contains 39 or 46 books, if you include the Apocrypha, and the New Testament contains 27 books. Okay, those 27 Christian documents were written in a language referred to as Koine Greek, which is Common Greek, the language that was commonly spoken during the Greco-Roman Empire in the 1st century CE. And Luke Timothy Johnson, who was my professor over at the Candler School of Theology at Emory, says that the New Testament is a series of documents of the early Christian movement that emerged in the 1st century CE in the areas surrounding the Mediterranean. And there is Dr. Johnson giving a lecture. And most of the material, or a lot of the material, I should say, that I take and teach in my classes comes from the writings of the New Testament written by him. He further goes on to say that the writings of the New Testament are first and foremost religious writings and were generated by a specifically religious movement and were written by and for adherents of that movement. So what that means is that the writings are speaking about life as related to God. So in light of the fact that these writings were written by a specifically religious movement for adherents of that movement, which came first? Not the chicken or the egg, but the Christian church or the writings of the New Testament? Okay, we'll answer that question. Hopefully you can answer it now. We'll answer it in class as well. So if these writings are speaking about life as related to God, the designation Testament is perfect, is a great name for these collections because a testament is a near synonym for covenant, which refers to an agreement, a contract, a vow, or a bond. And in biblical usage, it is generally a bond between God and humanity. So, for example, the covenant that God made with Noah, that was with God and humanity and everything else. But specifically, let's refer to the Mosaic covenant. I like to call it the Sinai covenant. This is the covenant that God made with Israel, with Moses as the mediator, that established Israel as God's chosen people. In that covenant, in exchange for God's provision and protection toward Israel, all Israel had to do was follow God's law. That was their response for God initiating His grace toward them, for God saying, you will be my people and I will be your God and I will protect you and I will get you to this land and I will help you keep this land and this land will prosper and you will prosper. But Israel broke God's law and didn't follow His ways. And so eventually Israel lost the land that God promised because they broke the law, and God eventually allowed them to be exiled. Now, while exiled, numerous prophets spoke of hope. But specifically, the prophet Jeremiah wrote in Jeremiah 31:31 that God would replace the old covenant with a new covenant. Now replace covenant with testament. So the gospel writers believed that Jesus had instituted the promised new covenant at the Last Supper that he held with his disciples. And this incident is recorded in all of the Gospels, but if you take a look at Matthew chapter 26, verses 27 and 28, that's a good depiction of that story. So as time went on, believing themselves to be the people of the new covenant that Jesus inaugurated before his death at the Last Supper, Christians eventually called their collection of Gospels, letters, and other sacred writings the New Testament. Okay, so that's where that designation Testament comes from, and that's where you get the designations Old Testament and New Testament. And remember that The collection, the Old Testament is not referred to as the Old Testament by Jews. It is referred to as the Tanakh, which stands for the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, or it's referred to as the Hebrew Scriptures, or the Hebrew Bible, or the Jewish Scriptures. The Jews do not refer to that as the Old Testament because for Jews who practice Judaism, there is no New Testament. Okay, just wanted to make sure we clarified that. Now, just because there's a New Testament, that doesn't negate the Old. There is an absolute relationship between the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible. In fact, the New Testament writers, which most of them were Jews, they regarded the Hebrew Bible as their scriptures. Those scriptures, those texts that are considered to be sacred and authoritative, having the power to command belief and prescribe their own behavior. These are the scriptures which dealt with, among many other things, the older covenant. Because Christians believe, though, that the covenants and promises made to Israel outlined in the Hebrew Bible were fulfilled in Jesus, and wrote of that fulfillment in their Gospels, and you see a lot of that fulfillment outlined in the Gospel of Matthew. The early Christians and the writers of the Christian text retained their Greek version of the Hebrew Bible as authoritative and suitable for religious instruction. In other words, they did not throw out the Hebrew Bible. They did not throw out their Hebrew texts at all. In fact, the New Testament writers regarded the Hebrew Bible as their principal source for documenting their claim that Jesus was Israel's prophesied Messiah. But instead of using the Hebrew Bible as written in the original Hebrew, they used the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, which is referred to as the Septuagint. So the Hebrew Bible that was used by the New Testament writers was not a Hebrew written text. They used that Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, called the Septuagint, as I just said. This Bible was produced for Greek-speaking Jews who lived in Alexandria, Egypt, which was then one of the world's largest centers of literary and scientific research. This version of the Hebrew Bible, which is abbreviated Roman numeral 70, was written around, the writing actually started around the 3rd century BCE and was completed around the 1st century CE. It became the standard biblical text for Jews throughout the Greco-Roman world and is the version quoted most frequently in the New Testament. So the New Testament then, you've got this Greek influence on the Hebrew scriptures because Jews began to not be able to speak Hebrew after the conquest of Alexander. So as you have the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, naturally following that, the Christian scriptures that were written by the New Testament writers were also written in Greek, known as Koine Greek. And that became the dominant tongue, actually, of the Eastern Mediterranean region after the conquest of Alexander the Great. Okay, so if at any point you have questions in this lecture, please write them down and we will address them during class. Okay, so what is contained in the New Testament? Well, you've got about 5 different major genres of literature. The first is referred to as Gospels, which are narratives of Jesus' ministry, death, and resurrection. There are 4 of them. These are depictions of the 4 writers of the Gospels in the New Testament, and that would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's also an account of the early church. This is the book of Acts. That's a narrative of crucial episodes in Christianity's early development. This is a depiction of Acts chapter 2, which is the sort of culminating event of the beginning of the early church. Then there is what's referred to as letters. There are many of those letters. There are 13 of them. Most of them are attributed to the Apostle Paul. And these letters were written to various Christian communities by not just Paul, but other people as well. There's also a genre referred to as a sermon or homily. Homily is spelled H-O-M-I-L-Y. And this sermon is what is commonly referred to as the letter to the Hebrews. Most scholars, though, do believe that it's not a letter, that it is, in fact, a sermon. And then finally, the last genre that we have is an apocalyptic vision. And that apocalyptic vision that people like to refer to as the end of the world but that's not really what apocalypse describes. We'll talk about that later. The apocalyptic vision is contained within the book of Revelation. So you have 5 different genres of literature contained within the New Testament. Now, there are lots of ways of studying the New Testament. There are scholars who take a variety of different approaches. But what Luke Timothy Johnson would ask in studying these texts, and what he feels is most important, and which really, to me, makes most sense, is an adequate model would ask these questions. Why do these writings even exist, and why do they look the way they do? For example, you have 4 different Gospels, but they do look different. Well, why? And it's a pretty intriguing question. It's a major question that we will ask as we go along in our study. How do we examine these writings as literary productions? Because they are writings, and so they are literary productions. And then how did they come to be? An adequate model would seek to answer these questions, he says. So this model would take into consideration then, in light of those questions, that there are 4 dimensions of New Testament texts. There's the anthropological dimension, the fact that these writings were written by people. They are fully human productions. We can't exclude divine inspiration, but we can't study that. So we take into consideration that these writings were written by people. Secondly, that there is a historical dimension of the text, and that we need to take into consideration that these texts were written during the 1st century CE in the context of the Mediterranean, in under 1st century Judaism, and that meant something very specific, and so we need to examine those symbols that were important to that particular religious movement. And then we have to understand that the writings were conditioned by the times and the places of this origin and the settings and intentions of these authors in that particular historical context. Okay, so the third dimension of the New Testament text that we need to take into consideration is their literary dimension, that they are compositions, and the finished form of these compositions is what we need to make sure that we are interpreting. Not that we're just getting little bits and bytes here and there. And not that we are looking at what they looked like before they became a part of the text that they are a part of. We have to take into consideration the composition as a larger work, the finished form. And we have to take into consideration their own literary conventions in the 1st century. So we have to take into consideration there are parables, and parables are interpreted in a different way than a letter is interpreted. So we have to take that into consideration. And then the 4th dimension is the religious dimension. And this is the dimension that Luke Timothy Johnson says that very many interpreters do not take this into consideration when they are interpreting the New Testament text. Once again, ensuring that we understand that these are religious writings generated by a religious movement for adherents of this movement, that they are writings speaking of life as related to God, and that these writings witness to and interpret the religious claims that these people claim to have had through Jesus Christ, these experiences with God that they have had through the resurrected Christ. So what does it all mean? This is how we interpret the text. We are looking at the text in light of the experience that these people had and their interpretation of what it means to be human before God. This is the experience that the first Christians claim to have had in the risen Christ. That is what they are writing about in the New Testament. So we need to understand that experience in its 1st century Mediterranean context, taking into consideration their own symbols of Judaism, not of Christianity, because Christianity comes out of Judaism. We've got to remember that. So we look at symbols that made Jews who they were. The symbol of the temple, for example, Torah, synagogue, all of these very important symbols that made them who they were. They had to be reinterpreted in light of this early Christian movement. So we need to make sure that we are interpreting the text in light of these variables. Okay, so that ends our first lecture. Write down your questions, Bring them to class. Thanks.